So welcome to the Blue Met Festival. Welcome to Mémoire à vif, Raw Memory. J'aimerais débuter aujourd'hui en reconnaissant que nous nous réunissons sur le territoire ancestral et actuel du peuple Kanien'kehá:ka, qui parle Kanien'keha, qui s'appelle Tiohtià:ke, et qui est aussi le territoire occupé et appelé Muinhing par les Anishinaabe. Nous nous réunissons ici dans un esprit de respect, de réconciliation et d'écoute. It occurs to me also every time that I think about colonialism and that if the original settlers had arrived here and learned rather than taking, things now, as we look at climate change, as we look at war, would look probably very different. Je vais commencer par vous présenter les panélistes ce matin, cet après-midi. Ouais. On va recommencer. We're going to rewind. On est l'après-midi. J'arrive à prononcer des mots. It's all good. On a donc 4 super belles panélistes aujourd'hui qui sont toutes lauréates des prix récents de la gouverneure générale. So I want to begin by congratulating all of you for your win last fall. And I do hope that there gets to be some party after the pandemic eases. We're happy to be here today en présentiel, and I wish the same thing for the celebration that should follow your books in person. Elles sont toutes très différentes dans leur parcours, dans les genres dans lesquels elles écrivent. Mais on va parler aujourd'hui un peu de mémoire, de traduction dans toutes les permutations figuratives de la traduction. Et je pense que ça touche à toutes vos œuvres. So I think that the themes that we'll broach are common to all of your works, despite the fact that you write either in fiction or in non-fiction, in poetry and other genres as well, in theater. Je veux souligner aussi que le public, je vous invite à fermer vos téléphones, premièrement. Je vois que quelques-uns et quelques-unes le font. Si vous avez des questions, on va garder environ 20 minutes à la fin pour des questions, mais si vous en avez au courant aussi, on n'est pas si nombreux. If you have questions, there's not so many of us that you can't just kind of pop up your hand, but I'll try to save a good chunk of time at the end so we can broaden the conversation. Je vous invite aussi à garder vos masques si vous êtes assis. Malheureusement, on est encore rendu là, so please keep your masks on. Sorry, je les deviens. Et je pense que c'est tout pour la logistique. C'est beau? Okay, so I'm going to begin by introducing Fanny Britt, Norma Dunning, Mishka Lavigne, and Sidika de Meyer, and then each one will read a short excerpt from their works, and then we'll open up the conversation to anything and everything, basically. Je vais présenter chaque écrivaine dans l'autre langue de celle dans laquelle elle écrit, pour s'assurer que les membres du public qui ont une facilité dans d'autres langues peuvent découvrir, dans le fond, des écrivaines et des autrices dans leur deuxième langue coloniale. Donc, Fanny Britt's originally from the Abitibi region. She grew up in Montreal. She graduated from the National Theatre School in playwriting, and she's written and translated numerous theatre plays. Her works have been produced at the Théâtre des Quatre, the Espace Go, and the Théâtre d'Aujourd'hui. She's also written books for young readers, adult fiction, and graphic fiction. She has twice won the Governor General's Award for theatre, the first time in 2013 for Bienveillance, and just recently last fall for her novel, Faire les sucres. Norma Dunning est une écrivaine Inuk, née au Québec et résidant actuellement à Edmonton, où elle enseigne à l'Université de l'Alberta. Son recueil Annie Muktuk and Other Stories a remporté en 2018 le prix de nouvelles et est traduit en français, en fait, par Daniel Grenier, pour ceux et celles qui veulent faire un tour à la librairie après. Et a donc remporté le prix de nouvelles qui est décerné à une première collection de nouvelles. Elle a également publié des œuvres de poésie qui explorent l'identité inuite et elle est lauréate du prix donc, de la gouverneure générale l'an dernier pour son recueil de nouvelles d'Aina, qu'elle a ici. Mishka Lavigne is a Canadian playwright, screenwriter, librettist, and theatre translator from Ottawa-Gatineau. Her work has been presented here and abroad. She writes and translates impressively in and out of French and English and has notably rendered works by Rosanna Dearchild also and Billy Ray Balcourt into French. She's a 2-time winner of the GG for Havre in 2019, and last year for the poetic movement-based play Copo. Sidika de Meyer est née à Amsterdam et a grandi au Canada. Elle vit actuellement à Kingston, en Ontario. Ses nouvelles et ses poèmes ont été publiés dans plusieurs revues et ouvrages collectifs. Elle a été finaliste au Prix du Gouverneur général et au Prix Pat Lowther pour sa poésie. Elle a remporté le Prix Canada Rights de la CBC. Son livre Alphabet, A Memoire of a First Language, a remporté le prix de la gouverneure générale dans la catégorie essai littéraire l'année passée. Donc, merci à toutes d'être ici aujourd'hui. Bienvenue. Est-ce que tout le monde nous voit assez bien? Tout le monde nous entend assez bien? OK. Donc, j'inviterai, en fait, je ne sais pas qui veut commencer. On n'a pas été assez organisé pour planifier qui va commencer. I don't know if anybody wants to read a small excerpt first. Otherwise, I'll volunteer someone. On va commencer à ma gauche dans ces cas-là, je sais pas si tu veux aller. Donc, on a hâte d'entendre un extrait de Faire les sucres.
Comme je sais qu'on va parler un peu de mémoire, puis aussi de comment la mémoire transforme ou comment l'affect transforme une expérience de la réalité, j'ai pensé lire un extrait qui aborde un petit peu cette idée-là, un très court extrait. Célia a appliqué de la lotion solaire sur les épaules et le dos d'Anthony et de Sean, leur nuque, leur ventre, les mollets, les bouts de nez. Elle ne pensait pas à l'enfant qu'elle aurait pu enduire de crème dans 1 an, 3 ans, 6 ans. Il n'y avait pas eu d'enfant, vraiment pas. En parlant d'une fausse couche, on trouve normal de dire qu'on a perdu un bébé, mais quand on se fait avorter, on ne dit pas cela. Dans les 2 cas, on perd un embryon ou un fœtus, selon le moment où la grossesse s'arrête. Un jour, Simone, la femme de Jeffrey, lui avait raconté sa fausse couche, qui remontait à 3 ans, avant l'arrivée de Sean, en précisant que c'était comme des règles abondantes. Célia avait d'abord voulu savoir si elle avait vu le bébé tomber. Elle avait utilisé ces mots. « As-tu vu le bébé tomber? » Et sa belle-sœur avait répondu qu'il n'y avait pas de bébé, du sang, quelques caillots, mais rien qu'elle n'avait déjà vécu pendant ces règles. Célia avait hoché la tête. « Pourtant, tu dis que tu as perdu un bébé, » avait-elle dit en maudissant sur le champ son indélicatesse. Simone avait répondu « Comme quoi la réalité est une bête étrange. » Elle lui avait confié que cette grossesse n'avait pas été prévue et qu'elle ne songeait pas à avoir un autre enfant à ce moment-là. Elle avait eu Anthony à 22 ans, à peine sortie de l'université. Pourtant, après sa fausse couche, elle avait furieusement souhaité retomber enceinte pour obtenir réparation, avait-elle dit. Et Sean était arrivé. Simone avait fait une fausse couche à 6 semaines. La grossesse de Célia avait pris fin, elle aussi, à 6 semaines. À présent, elle s'émerveillait de savoir que leur corps avait éprouvé la même chose et que pourtant, pas du tout. Bon, s'émerveiller n'était peut-être pas le terme approprié.
Thank you. So a passage about miscarriage and also alluding to abortion, which is timely for Mother's Day as well, the children that we think of and some of us mourn, and also the tragic events unfolding in the States this week. So thank you very much. Je te passe le micro.
Bon, repentir, palimpseste 4, elle. Il a neigé pendant 8 jours et 8 nuits. J'ai marché dans la gadoue sale, dans le dégelé et le regelé, vestige des roues des voitures. J'ai marché tellement longtemps que l'eau et le froid sont passés à travers l'épiderme de mes bottes. J'ai regardé le blanc propre des endroits peu fréquentés, mais je m'y suis pas aventurée. La tête me tournait juste à regarder ces territoires pas défrichés, ces territoires qui devraient pas être dans une ville qui grouille de monde, ces endroits pas aimés où personne n'a posé les pieds. J'ai marché comme une somnambule dans les souvenirs de toi, de nous, d'avant. J'ai essayé de saisir des moments de toi, de nous, d'avant, mais même avec mes mitaines, mes doigts avaient trop froid et ma main restait ouverte, les doigts figés, incapables de se refermer sur les choses. Je me suis tenue sur le pas de ta porte. J'ai tendu mes bras de somnambule vers la poignée, comme si c'était normal, comme si j'avais encore la clé, comme si c'était encore chez moi. Devant ta porte, le vent avait poussé une vague de neige immaculée de 8 jours et j'ai compris que les pas que j'avais remontés jusqu'ici ne pouvaient pas être les tiens. Je suis repartie en marchant dans mes pas à moi, des orteils aux talons. Le vent avait viré, la neige s'était arrêtée. Les gens étaient sortis déneiger, éliminer toutes les traces de la tempête. J'ai douté de l'existence de toi, de nous, d'avant. Gratter la neige jusqu'à l'asphalte.
Thank you. I'm so glad you read that section. It's from a section for a play called, the play is called Copo, but the section is called palimpsest. And that was something I had highlighted that I want to come back to because of the notion of palimpsests of memory and the kind of layers and layers that we see through. Go ahead, Sadiqa.
Thank you. Palimpsest is the name of my press for a segue. That's exciting. Okay, so briefly, this is, my book is a memoir of my transition from speaking Dutch to English, which I made between the ages of 9 and 12 approximately. Sometimes I translate my own poems in either direction. I was going to write forwards or backwards. It's a private little exercise, the taking apart of a gadget, to see what happens when I reassemble it. One of my English poems contained the word harbor, which for me conjures a generic image. There are ships, docks, and gulls, but it is nowhere that I can name. When I replaced it with the Dutch word haven, the picture was immediately distinct. I saw our former river harbor, a charmless place of silos and concrete piers, where St. Nicholas arrived on a boat each year in November with his cohort of Zwarte Pieten, white people, shamefully performing in blackface, speaking in invented Dutch. Haven was a bicycle ride on an overcast afternoon, during which my youngest brother sat in a seat on my father's handlebars. I was being somewhat reckless, biking in a slalom between the moorings, near the sheer drop to the water. My brother told me to stop, and then he repeated himself so desperately that I suddenly knew he loved me. Haven made contact with that epiphany, and harbor did not. Only the mother tongue's term remained resonant with the primacy of experience. That knowledge frightened me. Could I write in a language that would enchannel my earlier selves? The answer evolves as I work. Translating my own English lines becomes more than a game. When I am reminded of the depth of Haven, my ghosts enter the poem. And I am not in this alone. I'm doing what millions of others also have to do, making a life in the other tongue, writing and speaking as if to strike new sparks between English and myself.
Merci. C'est intéressant aussi de penser à justement le processus, la question, quand on se traduit d'une langue à l'autre, the forward and backwards, on traduit dans un sens et dans l'autre, mais c'est aussi à l'envers et à l'endroit. Et c'est which one is forward, which one is backward, lequel est à l'envers, lequel est l'envers et lequel est l'endroit, la langue de naissance, la langue maternelle ou et la langue apprise, quoi. Merci. Norma, give you the floor.
Okay, we're all going to the bar. That's what I'm going to read from. In this book, there's a continuation of Annie Muckluck, and there's one story called These Old Bones. And it's Annie probably 20 years later. And I will always say, you know, like, Annie just shows up, and I'm just shopping, minding my own business, and there she is, and I'm like, what do you want? So this is a continuation, and she's left the North. And she is, she's sitting in a bar, and we'll start here. Annie knew all that, knew that the old white men knew what the old white men were all about. And she sat there and sipped her wine and thought about what to watch on Netflix that night. One man with a white goatee and an even whiter hat looked at her from across the bar, caught her eye and shouted, "You are a remarkable-looking woman." Annie grinned and looked down at the bar counter. He came close to her and introduced himself. "I'm Alex, and you are?" "Annie." "Annie, what a lovely name. Where are you from?" "Oh, up north, quite a distance from here." "And where would that be? Churchill or someplace like that? You look native. Are you one of those, you know, what do they call them? Eskimos." Annie felt her shoulders start to tighten. She gave a half smile and a half nod. "Really? Hey, fellas, look over here. It's an Eskimo." She knew not to interact, no matter what. Not with a white guy, and especially not with an old white guy. She let her breath out and held her head a little higher. "Like the football team, you mean, Alex?" The bar burst into hard laughter, peals of it slip-sliding everywhere. Annie saw the bellies of all those white men jiggling like Mr. Claus. She saw their white beards ho-ho-hoing and their blue eyes glittering like the stars on a Christmas tree. Annie saw what she always saw in white men. Annie saw hate.
Merci. Les personnages du premier recueil et du deuxième sont tellement filmiques. Je ne serais pas du tout surprise de voir une télésérie ou quelque chose en survenir. All your characters are so filmic that you can almost see them. I mean, you can see them in imagining, but I wouldn't be surprised at all to see like a TV series pop out of these people with these characters. They're fantastic. Thank you so much for the readings. Je vous suggère que d'aller chercher les livres après. Il y a la librairie, évidemment, Paragraphe qui les vend en haut dans l'espace Godin. So I really recommend picking up these books and all the other ones. I'd also like to point out that with your ticket, I believe you get an equivalent purchase at the bookstore. So take advantage of that. I want to begin by... Pardon?
I've been told that mine is sold out.
Oh, no.
But there were only 6 that came in, so...
Oh, I'm so sorry. You'll have to go to the publisher's website and order a copy, ou aller à la bibliothèque aussi. Le prêt public, ça marche très bien. Donc, si les livres n'y sont plus, trouvez-les à quelque part, ça vaut vraiment ça vaut le détour. I want to begin by talking about translating place and translating not just language, but I was struck, Norma, in the epigraph to your book, you address the book, or you dedicate the book to Inuit who get up and leave the North. And that phrase, get up and leave, is such an act of like deliberate and almost tired distancing from the birthplace, from the landscape that defines the characters. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process of how you translate place. And when I saw that epigraph, I also wondered, or the dedication rather, I wondered, who are you translating for and in what direction? Are you translating the North for the South or the South for the North?
I think either or. And it's about context and how Inuit are always supposed to only be in the North, but we live everywhere. And I think we are not recognized as people who live in the South, who get up every day, go to work, go to Tim Hortons, read a paper, like regular, normal people. And there were times when I was a university student that I did not want to identify. And it was based on the stereotypical questions, do you eat raw meat? Do you? That kind of stuff. And so the book is dedicated to Inuit who are like me, who are still members of a land claims area and are recognized as members, but who live outside of that stereotypical context of the North, of the far North. And it's intentional to bring everyday Inuit into everyday life in the South. So that was, I don't know if it's so much about writing out of the North and into the South, or trying to normalize Inuit people as everyday Canadians who get up and go to work and get university degrees and raise their children. And it was I was hoping to bring that through this book. Thank you.
Quite, yeah. I want to follow up on the idea of those stereotypes that are so prevalent. Je posais une question en fait à propos du titre de ton livre, Faire les sucres. Je me demande pourquoi. Donc c'est l'histoire d'un... Je vais résumer très grossièrement, mais dans le fond, il y a un restaurateur qui veut acheter une cabane à sucre. On peut difficilement trouver quelque chose de plus stéréotypement québécois qu'une cabane à sucre. Je me demande pourquoi tu as choisi, et quelle réalité est-ce que ça traduit cette fiction-là? Est-ce que tu es allé chercher quelque chose de particulier? Qu'est-ce qui t'a inspiré? Parce que il y a une scène au début où il montre il parle de comment on fait la tire d'érable. Mm-hmm. C'est très évocateur, mais ça aurait pu être plein d'autres choses. Je me demande qu'est-ce qui t'a poussé à choisir ça?
Ben, je pense que j'étais intéressée de jouer justement avec le symbole, ce symbole-là qui est si fort, mais dans une perspective d'abord, je pense que je suis arrivée à ce sujet-là dans une perspective d'abord assez ironique, assez critique. Pourtant, j'ai un attachement très fort à l'idée de l'érablière, encore plus que de la cabane à sucre, mais l'action de faire les sucres, de tirer la sève des érables, de la transformer en une matière qui est comestible. Il faut dire que j'ai une cousine qui est sucrière, donc qui est plus jeune que moi, qui est une jeune femme dans la trentaine qui a décidé de cultiver cette terre-là, des arbres qui n'avaient jamais été cultivés, donc qui a fait tout ce processus-là, mais pas du tout de la manière que le personnage d'Adam entreprend cette aventure-là. Pour moi, lui arrive vraiment en espèce de... dans sa vision à lui, en espèce de sauveur d'une terre qui est en train de péricliter, d'une famille qui a plus les moyens de la conserver. Donc, c'est vraiment lui-même est évidemment un cliché d'homme blanc successful, restaurateur, une vedette aussi, qui pense en fait qu'au contact de cette authenticité-là, il va lui-même augmenter son authenticité. Et cette idée-là m'intéressait. J'avais vu un documentaire qui parlait de l'érable, puis il y avait comme Gilles Vigneault et Fred Pellerin qui parlaient de l'érable et tout ça, puis bon, j'aime beaucoup Gilles Vigneault, puis je veux dire, j'ai aucun problème avec ces deux personnes-là, mais je me souviens qu'en le regardant, ça m'avait frappé cette espèce de... cette mythologie-là qu'on se fait de l'érable, et en même temps, tout ce qui était tu, tout ce qu'on disait pas à travers ça, c'était l'exploitation de la terre, et c'était l'exploitation des gens qui exploitent la terre. C'est toute cette chaîne-là qui m'intéressait. Je trouvais que c'était un point de départ riche.
La notion d'exploitation est intéressante aussi. You mentioned tout ce qui est tu, everything that is silenced in a book that necessarily so. And I have a question actually for all four of you about the genres in which you write, both some of the poetry that finds its way into your work, the poetry that informs yours as well. Dans une pièce de théâtre, par exemple, il y a plus de silence que de paroles, et pourtant la parole porte tout sur papier quand on le voit. Et donc je me demande comment vous conjuguez ces silences. What gets silenced? How do you decide, I guess, what remains unsaid in a book? How much of the dialogue, for example, that you put in, or in the sections that you have that are more poetic, ou dans une pièce de théâtre, qu'est-ce qu'on leur met dans la bouche? What do you put into your characters' mouths? What gets left out and why, I guess? Donc, je vous ouvre la parole à vous quatre.
Mes personnages, en général, ont tendance à beaucoup dire les choses, à beaucoup nommer les actions, à parler pour exister. Copo, c'est un texte qui est un peu différent dans ce sens-là. C'est un texte dans lequel j'ai essayé d'enlever le plus possible. C'est très court, Copo, c'est 9200 mots, c'est 1h05 sur la scène. Il y a beaucoup d'espace pour que ça respire, ce texte-là. Mais toujours, quand on écrit du théâtre, en quelque part, c'est qu'on écrit une partition qui est incomplète. Parce que le reste vient, bon, avec le jeu des comédiens, avec la mise en scène, avec toutes les conceptions qui vont, puis avec l'espèce de place que prend le public aussi, parce que c'est destiné à un public, c'est destiné à être vu en direct, c'est un art vivant. Donc, la réception du public ou ce que le public reçoit fait partie de la représentation ou fait partie de comment l'écriture se transforme même au fil de chacune des représentations de la pièce. Donc, si on a un soir où tout le monde rit à cette blague-là, puis le lendemain, personne rit, bien, on a déjà un changement de rythme dans comme ce que les comédiens vont faire sur scène. Donc, même avec le théâtre, j'ai l'impression que ça s'approche de façon à ce que le texte lui-même ou la présence du silence à l'intérieur du texte se transforme selon le public qui est dans la salle, selon ce que les metteurs en scène, les concepteurs vont venir injecter à l'intérieur aussi. Fait que c'est vraiment un jeu sur qu'est-ce qu'on a besoin de dire, puis qu'est-ce qui va être dit autrement, donc par une conception, par la mise en scène, par le jeu.
Et la présence du public est intéressante aussi. So the comment about having the silences filled in by, in this case, the audience for a play, but by the readership too. We seldom think about that. I'd be curious to hear the rest of you also on how you decide what gets insinuated or what gets carrément non dit.
What I know is that I tend to, it leads me into deciding if I'm writing a book or a play. What I want to leave unsaid. often leads me, because I think in theater what I enjoy the most is what is left unsaid between people. There's the huge mystery of the sous-text, but in books, I guess I go for books when I want to work on a character that doesn't necessarily say what they're thinking. I'm usually have characters that don't really say what they mean, but that I need to explore what they would say, what they wish to say, or what happens behind the mundane conversations of everyday life. Et ça, je ne peux pas le faire avec le théâtre, ou en tout cas pas du tout de la même façon. Je peux le faire, on peut le faire par des monologues intérieurs, des apartés, tout ça, mais on dirait que ce qui m'intéresse toujours au théâtre, c'est l'incommunicabilité entre les gens, alors que ce qui m'intéresse, ce qui m'attire vers l'écriture de romans, c'est l'incommunicabilité souvent dans une relation à soi, vraiment, beaucoup.
Et pourtant, dans ton roman, on a l'impression d'être dans la tête de chacun et chacune, de chaque personnage, et la collision littérale et figurative des différentes vies. Il n'y a rien d'omniscient. C'est presque une certaine honte quand on se sort de la conscience d'un personnage pour embarquer dans l'autre. Je trouve ça intéressant.
C'est ça. C'était comme un narrateur intérieur, mais alterné. Là. Ouais.
Vraiment. What about you, Steve? I'd be curious to hear, because you have these sections in the book that also, the book is mostly prose, and then these little moments of either lists of words or these almost poetic sections, really, that try to capture some of the weirdness of thinking in two languages or living in two languages, that moment of transition, basically, between the Dutch and the English in your case.
Yeah, I'm going to come at your question a slightly different way, though.
Go for it.
Like, one interesting thing is there's a Dutch verb, zwijgen, which means to not speak, like particularly in a situation where you might be expected to say something or to answer. So the book talks about that a bit, about the like zwijgen around racism and misogyny and various forms of silence that exist in Dutch culture and in Canadian one as well. But what your question made me think of partly was in this book, I write about people close to me. Like I share stories of my family, some friends, and like some of them with permission are named by name. It's nonfiction. And that was an interesting thing to hold and to think about, needing to write what I did need to write, like, being true to my own instincts about where the piece had to go. But also, this idea of the writer having like a sliver of ice in their heart, like, these are living relationships for me, and I also want to honor that and hold the people involved with respect and a wholeness to their stories. So, yeah, in the end, that was a major thought process for me, was like, how do I tell everything that I need to say here, but also do it in a way that that is loving towards those who I'm still close to. And yeah, what I ended up doing, so my brothers, I sent them pieces and asked for permissions. Friends, I sort of let it be. But with my parents, I sent them the manuscript before publication, and I said, you can't approve it, this is it, but I just want you to be able to read it before other people do, so that you're ready when it comes out. And that went really well. I had a nervous 2 weeks while they made me wait for an answer, but like they responded very supportively, and I think that kind of silence, the balance of silence and speaking, I'll probably continue to explore. I see it coming up again in future works, because you go deeper into your material and there's more. So yeah.
If they had asked you to change something, or if they had spoken about, I mean, it's not a book that's sort of like some dirty tell-all. It's not, but obviously you create them as characters, and so they're framed in some way. If they had asked you to change things, would you have? Like, how far would that allegiance have gone, or that loyalty, or whatever that?
Right. No, I wouldn't have. Like in this case, I made a pretty, I was sure in that decision of like, this is what I've written. It was more the respect of saying like, you can have like half a year to sort of sit with it before you have to maybe talk to your friends about it, you know,
Right.
depending on how much the book gets read. So, yeah, I mean, I do feel it's really important to be loyal to what the material wants, but also then to extend that respect to the people involved.
Yeah, definitely. In your book, Norma, I feel like there's more, in some stories more than others. There's a sense that loyalty extends to real people as well. They do feel like real people in your books. And so I wonder what you, how much space you give them to hold their own stories, how much space you give your characters. Do they come from somewhere? Do they feel real, obviously, when we read them? But there's such a sense, I'm thinking, for example, of the scene where the father has the shotgun. It's like this really blood-curdling scene. And you wonder, the silence there contains so much, like he's lying on the floor afterwards and kind of crumpled up in a ball. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you probably have as background and as between the lines that the reader doesn't get, or some readers don't get?
Well, I think the reader should get it. I hope I write it well enough that people do get it. But I always think, you know, that I love my characters, and if I don't love them, nobody is going to love them. And I always think if I do not love what I write, nobody else is going to love it. So it's giving them my best. That's how I look at them. Some of it is very hard to write. Some of it is the little bit that I was reading from. Prior to that, there is a rape scene. And when I was writing this on a Saturday afternoon, I had a frozen pizza in my oven, and because that's how you cook when you write. And I was writing, and I was feeling like I was making myself feel sick. I feel sick, but I keep writing it. And it's now I've written myself into vomiting. I nailed it. That's the thing, I think. I nailed it. But also, you know, on the other side of that, if I make myself laugh, then it's funny. I know it's funny. If I make myself cry, it's perfect. So it's how I think we develop these relationships with. For me, the characters are real, but, you know, and I always say I have to write them out of my apartment because they'll just keep living with me in here until I finish writing them. And it's loving them. If we do not love them, nobody else will love them.
And yet Annie came back. You didn't get rid of her, or you haven't yet.
No,
She'll
keep showing up.
Yeah. That's an interesting comment about loving your characters, even the ones that are unreliable or are difficult to love. Et je suis en train d'oublier, là, j'ai lu une entrevue avec, je pense que c'est toi qui avais dit dans une entrevue, il faut les aimer même quand ils sont des trous de cul. Ça se peut-tu, ce que tu disais?
Je sais pas si c'est moi qui ai dit ça, mais je suis d'accord avec ça. Mais c'est-à-dire, mais c'est les aimer. Moi, je dis toujours comme, je veux être aimante et impitoyable avec eux. Fait que, I love them, but I also... I'm merciless with them also. So it's kind of, we're very tough mothers on those characters, but mothers nonetheless who love, you know, these children.
We hope that they grow up and leave the house eventually, in most cases. What was the hardest thing for all of you to translate into language? Like, I was struck by the violence of that rape scene, but also some of the really tender moments in the book. I was struck also by le corps dans ta pièce est tellement représenté de façon limpide et évincée que je me suis demandé comment est-ce que tu t'y retrouvais pour t'asseoir et puis embarquer dans cette physicalité à certains moments, où vraiment on a l'impression que ça pourrait être dansé, vraiment, j'ai pensé. Ou bien certaines scènes de séduction, there's moments, I mean, sex scenes are notoriously impossible to write. Violence is very difficult to write. How much do you say without letting it become a cliche of itself, and how much do you put in, how much do you give your reader? And I'm curious about what was the hardest thing for each of you then to try to grapple with in terms of what was verbalized?
I don't want to affect my sales, but I don't think my book has either sex or violence, sadly.
We should buy it anyway. Non? La séduction, ça s'est venu tout seul? Les scènes de...
Non, c'est pas facile à écrire, mais est-ce que c'est ça qui est le plus difficile? Pour moi, le plus difficile, c'est la vérité, tu sais. C'est pas nécessairement la violence ou la sexualité, c'est la vérité dans l'écriture. C'est de rendre c'est ça, c'est la lutte constante contre les clichés, mais pas juste les clichés dans les images, mais les clichés dans les mots, c'est les chemins initiaux que des fois la pensée peut prendre, puis qui limitent dans le fond l'expérience qu'on pourrait vivre une fois qu'on dépasse ça. Moi, je donne beaucoup de crédit à ma relation avec Geneviève Thibault au Cheval Doux, mon éditrice, qui est une directrice littéraire vraiment exceptionnelle, puis qui sait trouver les forces d'un texte aussi, tout en identifiant tous les pièges un après l'autre. Pour moi, c'est ça qui est difficile. Ouais.
And I guess a good editor does that, right? Catches you on your lapses in truthiness, even in fiction, and explains you to yourself better, or makes you explain yourself to yourself better, I think, for sure. Est-ce qu'il y en a d'autres qui veulent aborder? Anybody else want to address? Sorry, I'm switching back and forth in the same sentence. Anybody else want to address the subject of les difficultés de...
Ben, Copo, en quelque part, j'ai peut-être pas beaucoup de mérite à ce niveau-là parce que Copo, c'est né d'un processus d'écriture de plateau. Donc, il y a eu une grosse partie de travail de mouvement et de corps qui a été fait par le metteur en scène Éric Perron avec les comédiens Frédéric Thérien puis Marc-André Charette avant que le texte existe. Donc, il y avait du travail de corps. Puis, on est parti aussi du travail de l'artiste visuel d'Ottawa, Stephen Thompson. Donc, ça, c'était notre matériau de départ dans l'idée qu'on voulait dialoguer avec une autre forme d'art. Moi, j'avais déjà travaillé avec des musiciens. Éric, le metteur en scène, avait déjà travaillé avec des danseurs. Donc, on s'était dit, dialoguons avec autre chose, une chose qu'on ne connaît pas, une chose qui est plus loin peut-être des arts vivants, fait qu'on est allé vers l'art visuel. Fait qu'on avait un corpus d'œuvres de Stephen Thompson, on avait du travail de mouvement, tous ces matériaux-là, distillés, tout ça, ont commencé à faire naître les fragments qui sont devenus copeaux. Fait que ça a été un travail en laboratoire sur presque, sur 5 ans pour arriver à la production qu'il y a eu en 2020. Nous, on était sur scène quand les théâtres ont fermé, donc on a perdu certaines de nos représentations. Bon, on pensait que c'était pour 2 semaines, mais bon, c'est pas vrai. Fait que là... mais c'est ça, ça a été vraiment 5 ans de travail à coup de laboratoire avec toute l'équipe de création. Il y a eu quand même cette partie-là de travail à la scène qui a donné du texte. Le texte est tout de moi. Il a majoritairement été écrit en 2016, un petit peu en 2017, mais il s'est peaufiné au fil des laboratoires. Il y avait des fragments, même en 2019, où un fragment, OK, il saute parce qu'il ne marche pas. On l'a essayé de 38 façons, puis non, ça ne fait pas partie de cette pièce, ce texte, on l'enlève. Fait que vraiment, ce travail-là, c'est beaucoup fait aussi à la scène. Puis c'est ce qui est un peu différent quand on publie du théâtre, c'est qu'il n'y a pas particulièrement de travail éditorial qui se fait avec la publication d'une pièce de théâtre. Ce qui est dans le livre, c'est ce qui était sur la scène. Mais le travail éditorial comme tel a été fait, mais d'une autre façon, puis en salle, puis sur la scène, puis avec une équipe. Puis c'est un genre de travail éditorial, mais complètement autre aussi. Donc, c'est ça. Mais Copo, son processus de création était très particulier, puis était très lié à ce spectacle-là qu'il y a eu en mars 2020. Moi, j'étais pas convaincue que ce texte-là était publiable sans le spectacle. C'est mon éditrice qui m'a convaincue. Je veux dire, visiblement, je lui en suis très reconnaissante. Mais elle avait manqué le spectacle. Elle avait des billets pour un des soirs qui a été annulé. Puis quand je lui avais envoyé par la suite, elle a dit « Ah non, ça se tient là, vraiment comme un objet livre, un objet texte. » Puis je suis contente parce que c'était tellement, tellement ancré dans cette pratique-là pour donner ce spectacle-là, que ça m'a pris beaucoup de temps de dissocier peut-être un peu les deux. Puis là, c'est drôle, il y a eu il y a quelques jours une lecture du texte en France. Le texte est en train d'être traduit en anglais aussi. Donc, il va revivre d'autres façons qui ne sont pas le spectacle qu'on a créé pendant 5 ans. Puis, je suis très intriguée. On dirait que j'y crois pas encore que ça va arriver, là, que ça va exister ailleurs que dans ce spectacle-là.
So comme quoi having editors in that kind of process come before the actual play happens. The editing is in the editors are the actors or the director or the other people who contribute various visual art, music and so forth. C'est la première fois que tu travaillais comme ça de façon aussi intense, disons? C'est la première fois que
oui, en écriture de plateau. J'ai un autre texte qui a commencé en écriture de plateau, puis que finalement, bon, tout ce qu'on avait fait a été un peu scrappé, puis c'est devenu autre chose. Mais ce spectacle-là, c'était une volonté d'essayer de voir jusqu'où on pouvait aller avec ça. Puis que c'était un long processus. Puis c'était mon premier processus comme ça. J'espère que ce ne sera pas mon dernier. Ça m'a vraiment beaucoup plu comme processus. Mais c'est sûr que c'est très labor intensive. C'est très différent. Mais c'est le fun d'avoir tout le monde, d'avoir toute l'équipe, d'être dans l'équipe, disons, du début à la fin, parce que souvent les auteurs, les autrices comme moi, admettons, qui ne font pas de mise en scène, à un moment donné, je donne mon texte à quelqu'un, puis après ça, c'est comme si ça ne m'appartenait plus exactement. Mais là, vraiment, avec Copo, là, c'était du début à la fin. J'ai changé des choses jusqu'à 2 semaines avant le spectacle. Fait que c'était particulier à cause de ça comme processus.
Merci. I want to... yeah, go ahead, Sadiqa.
Well, I just have a thought about the question as well of like what was hardest to translate or bring forward. And what I was thinking about was this book, I started writing it in response to my first book of poetry came out. A few people, maybe 3, I think, in like interviews or they said they could hear the Dutch or see the Dutch in the writing. And I didn't, because it's just second nature to, like, it wasn't something, unless I was explicitly, like, there's a few moments where there's actual Dutch in the text, but they said it's there in the English, and that after that I just started sort of taking notes on moments when I noticed it, but I really had to ask myself, like, where is the Dutch? You know, like, what's sonically and vocabulary-wise, like what decisions am I making without ever thinking about them that make my English distinct? And that it's different from looking outward and looking at something in the world and like using those observation skills to write. It's much more about drawing stuff up to the surface that you weren't aware of. Because it's just buried in you or it's a part of you. So I think that, yeah, for me that was the most challenging part, was sort of turning this the inner vision on and saying like, oh, that's what I do and that's where it comes from. Yeah.
And sometimes you can't even see it, but how it feeds the poetry is evident, even in that list. There's a list of words at one point in the book that points out how West Germanic languages have these great compounds that English has sort of swallowed. You've got this word for anemia, which literally translates to like blood poverty, which I love, right? That's just like the poetry writes itself with the Dutch. Thank you. Did you want to weigh in on the hard parts?
I'm forgetting what the question was.
The hard ones.
I want to say this, that for me, it is because I bring up many issues within each story, and if we look at Daina, the last story, that is based on a Inuit girl who was found dead on a golf course in Edmonton. And she had a birth alert against her name as a vulnerable young pregnant girl. And her baby, was taken from her within 24 hours. So she did get to hold him for a little bit. And anyhow, she remains a cold case. But within the story, I also talk about the spirits who come to get her And Kivigello is saying, we're picking up too many young ones. We're coming in to get too many young ones now. And that alludes to Inuit teen suicide, the highest rates in Canada. And so for me, like I get this opportunity to bring about something that is really very real into a fictional story. But what becomes critical for me as a writer is that, that very last story has to end with some form of hope, because I want that for the next generations of Inuit. And so for me, that becomes very, very important to, within those last 2 pages, to bring hope to the next generations. I don't write for me, I write for them. And I think we have to think about, who do I write for? Why do I do that? I think we all do it because we have a sickness and we can't stop ourselves. And so we're just going to do it regardless. But what is the purpose in it? And what do I leave behind? It isn't about being some superstar writer. It's about what happens to other young Inuit who read my work, and wanting to leave hope for them. And that becomes the most important part in whatever is the last story.
What's the feedback been like? I'm curious, from either young Inuit or people who have lived this kind of colonial violence. Have you had any echoes from that young generation, especially? No, I can't say that I've had, young Inuit people say, "Hey, thanks." No, I can't say that that's happened. But what matters to me is that those words are out there, and they're out in the world, and hopefully something good comes from it all. That's what matters. There's a great moment in the earlier story where Grandpa Chevy talks to his grandson, and there's a line. It's much more lighthearted. There's nothing, quite as daunting statistically or colonially going on. But the line is something like, "And then for a moment they shared their memory," or something like that. I'm paraphrasing horribly, but I think I get that sense with the more with the darker sections as well, that there's a sense of shared memory that you don't even you step into it and you're part of the same memory all of a sudden as the people who came before. Yeah. And as those who will come after. Mm-hmm.
But it's always about how much do you give and how much do you keep. And I think people, especially with Indigenous writing, there's that expectation that, it's all about voodoo and here I'm going to tell you about it, and I'm not. I never will. And so there is some that will always stay with me. It'll never, ever go onto a page. And the fun part for me of writing about Grandpa Chevy, and because my nephews used to come visit lots when they were little, and I would pin them to the ground and lick their face. They'd get so mad at me. They'd be so grossed out, and they're like, "I hate you, Auntie," and that's fine. But so to put that, that memory of licking their faces, having Grandpa lick their faces, it was fun for me. So we can take these little tidbits, of memory, our own memory, and turn it into something fun.
Of course, and the nephews read that, they're still like, "Ah." We could talk forever. Yeah, I was going to open it up to the audience. Exactly. Allez-y. Si vous voulez poser des questions en français ou en anglais, go ahead, and I'll translate into the other language just for just for posterity. Go ahead.
I wanted to pick up on what you were talking about, how you make decisions about what you will share and what you won't share. And I'm curious if the other writers also have a system in your own minds, or a set of values that you use to decide what you'll share and what you won't. I'm just curious about that. It's really interesting.
La question donc porte sur ce qui est partagé et ce que les autrices gardent pour elles dans le processus de rédaction, de création.
Je vais y aller. Je pense que je transforme beaucoup de choses. On dirait que ma boussole, c'est que si les choses sont suffisamment transformées puis que je pars de ce que moi j'ai ressenti dans une expérience d'enfance ou peu importe, ou même juste une expérience d'interaction avec qui que ce soit, quand je le transforme suffisamment en fiction, je me sens assez à l'aise d'utiliser ce que je veux. Mais ce qui me préoccupe, c'est l'idée d'exploiter la mémoire de l'autre. Ça, c'est important pour moi. Donc, les fois où c'est arrivé, j'ai vraiment consulté les gens qui étaient concernés pour m'assurer qu'ils étaient à l'aise. Mais ce que je réalise maintenant, c'est qu'il y a tout un pan de ma mémoire que je ne suis pas prête à partager encore par égard pour... C'est pas ma pudeur personnelle, c'est par égard pour ceux qui m'entourent. Donc ça va attendre. C'est pas pour tout de suite, je crois.
Si vous voulez, I don't think we need to translate everything, but you're at ease in both languages. Okay, at ease.
I understood just enough to think I might be repeating something you said, but it's possible, but that's fine. What I think about for me is like I write confessionally, that confessional poetry. Memoir is obviously a confessional genre, and I mean that's a term that I am really trying to claim back from its maligned status as a woman's thing to do, and like it has so much power, and why not draw from our lives? That's what we know most intimately. So what I think about though is it's always important. I'm never writing something just to say, oh, I need to get this off my chest, or I need to have this heard, or, you know, like, I think that's a kind of confessional that doesn't work for me, and that's not what writing is for. Like, if I'm telling a story of my life, or my, you know, in a poem bringing up experience, there's a purpose. It's in the framework of an idea that I'm working with. The lived experience may be a form of evidence or of witnessing, but it's never, yeah, I would say that's my criterion, it's never just hear me out because this thing happened and I need to talk about it. That's not for my work, yeah.
I did not repeat that.
Oh, I'm not sure if that's good or bad. That means I misunderstood.
There's always bound to be some overlap. Do you want to address the question? Anything, how you withhold, or what you withhold, and how you decide what you keep for yourself?
Well, you know, it's based on family. It's based on traditional story, and how much of that do you put out into mainstream. And there are things that will never, you know, be spoken outside of community, and will never go onto a page. And it should be like that, you know, and it's, Inuit have always, you know, more oral and remain very much an oral culture. And so how much do you give people, you know, and do I have the authority? You know, that's always most important. You would have to get permissions. I know I would have to get permissions. And so there's things that just are left off. And, you know, people can wrestle with it on their own. I don't think we have to give our readers everything. We don't. You know, it's up to a reader to do a bit of work too. And for me, when I use Inuktitut, I wish there was no glossary. I wish that the reader actually had to go and find that word and what it means. And I think I write it well enough that they have an idea. But at the same time, that is always, with every book, is, you know, okay, we're going to italicize all the Inuktitut. That is what we're doing. And I will say, why? Why? Why do you make it different? Is Inuktitut, you know, not on par with English or French or North Macedonian? You know, like it goes on. And so why is this why is that language being italicized? And I will say it's unfair. That's unfair. But, you know, there are publishers who are very firm, and they're like, no, it will be italicized. So it's a battle, every book.
I had that question for both you and Sadiq, actually, because the Latin in your book, however, there's a few Latin phrases that are italicized, and the Dutch in yours is, and I wondered what and often, as you say, it's the publishers, you know, that the argument begins and ends often with them. But I'd be curious to hear from you as well, Sadiq, on because it's a book about language, and so why you decided to italicize the language that was so close. And in your case, how the Latin slipped into italics then. Dead languages get the treatment.
I just don't like that it's treated, for me, when I see it italicized, to me it becomes less than.
I totally
This is less than English. English holds more power than Inuktitut. Which language has been in Canada longest? Inuktitut. But we have to italicize it. And I don't agree with it.
And to speak to your point, I do think that almost when there was no instance which I didn't realize there was a glossary until I got to the end, actually, and there was no instance in which the context didn't make it clear. So I think it works very well.
But then you have to, for me, so you create the glossary for them, and then there's like one fact checker, another fact checker, another fact, and so by that you're just sick of it. You know, just so sick
because I
of
said
it.
so.
Yeah, because I said so never works, and so.
But those are just very often publisher decisions. I translated a book of poetry where there was Cree, and in English the Cree is not italicized, and there is no glossary at the end. And if you don't understand it with context, then whatever. Like, you don't understand it. And the French had a glossary and was italicized, and I thought that was not the best decision. But there's nothing I could do to argue against it, and that I find it sucks a little bit when you get it and it's just there and you're like, ugh, I never wanted this glossary. The only thing I was able to argue is put all of the glossary at the end rather than have them all into footnotes. But, you know.
Especially for poetry, that becomes part of the text then. Otherwise,
So yeah, the Dutch in my book is italicized, which was my own decision. I did that partly because there's quite a bit of common ground. So words like water and land are identical, and so I did want to distinguish. And the other is that some of the chapters are a little bit technical, and they take apart poems, and they're fairly detailed. And I wanted to make that, just an accessible enough reading process that people weren't struggling with that aspect when I'm already asking them to get into poetry in a way that's maybe deeper than the average reading. So yeah, I did decide to. But like, what's positive is then excerpts were published in journals, and most of them have new standards. They don't italicize anymore. So those guidelines are changing, fortunately, and so then they took them out, and that was okay for the excerpts, but it's just a device meant to make the book easier to read.
typographical and visual, and as opposed to having a value-laden judgment then, for
That's
sure.
right.
I'd be happy to turn back to the audience for questions if anyone has any. Daisy.
I'm going to stop because otherwise you won't understand me. If I understand correctly, you write in Inuktitut as well as in English?
Not complete, not fluent.
Not fluently, okay. And do you write in Dutch as well as in English?
Yeah, I do. So there's a little bit in the book about that, but I do write Dutch poetry. I haven't published books in Dutch, but I've published in journals, and I'm like the way that most people's language development happens, or attrition happens over time. I read Dutch very fluently. I understand it perfectly. I can speak it. Like, I don't think most people would know that I was English, but writing is the hardest of them all. Just writing at the level of that I would expect from myself in English. So it's a work in progress, and it is kind of exciting to sometimes like make less sense or just think, oh, this is much more mysterious material to me. Yeah.
Now, if I understood correctly, you said sometimes the words come to you in Dutch, and you put the word in Dutch, but like you, writing a whole piece or a whole story or a whole poem in Dutch is more of an effort for you.
Yeah, it's a different, in English, I feel like, it's not so much that it flows, but like, if I choose to, I have a very high degree of control. I can know exactly what I'm doing with the syntax and the words. Like, it's almost like, that's the medium of comfort. In Dutch, it's slippery. It's sort of, it's going, but I'm not sure what verb is, what verb tense is perfect there. Like maybe that word is invoking things that I'm not quite aware of. I don't have the same sense of, maybe, yeah, I'm trying to compare it to like, maybe English is like drawing something with coloring pencils with this fine tip and you have all this control, and then in Dutch I'm painting and it's like, oh, what's happening? And it's interesting.
And do you write in both English and French?
Yeah, I do write both in English and in French. I'm published in both English and French, and I translate in both directions as well.
What I'm trying to get at now with the whole discussion of the importance of the two languages here in Quebec, and my own experience, what I wish I could share, is is it emotionally a different experience to write in Dutch? Well, you're saying it's more difficult because English flows more easily or comes more easily. But for you, does it feel like is there a different emotional experience writing in English as opposed to writing in French?
Donc la question pose sur le poids relatif d'écrire dans une langue qui était la langue maternelle ou qui est une langue maternelle et ou l'autre.
Est-ce que l'expérience émotionnelle ou l'expérience d'écrire est différente d'après la langue dans laquelle tu écris?
Yes and no. To me, it's mostly about what French feels more personal. But with English, I feel like I can Copo is a very personal play, and I feel like I couldn't have written it in English. But let's say like my play Shorelines is a play that is a little bit more political, and has aspects of talking about climate change, talking about class divides, talking about political issues that I read most about in English. So the play came to me in English. So it's hard to say. It's kind of where the story takes root in me, or where the story I feel is going to lead. I do write a bit of poetry as well in French and in English. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. I consider my native language to be French, but I grew up in a place where English was spoken all around me. So let's say like to play in the street with other kids, it was English. So English has been a language that I've spoken for a long time, but learning to be a very good writer in English took a lot longer. I started writing in English and making sense when I was a teenager, but I did all of my schooling in French. And my parents speak French at home, but my mom also speaks English. So it's a little bit all over the place.
I wonder if that in relation to other authors like Nabokov writing Lolita in English. People who are, were Russian speaking who write in English, and that kind of thing happens all the time. So when I read those books, I often wonder if that's a special effort or if it feels different, you made me think of it with your reference at the beginning to the word for Harvard. And I thought, is there an emotional connection to language, I think? And does that come into the writing experience? That was the basis of my question. So thank you.
I feel like I'm more vindictive in English, and I feel like I'm more intimate in French. I think those are the right words I wanted to use.
That's fascinating. I think if you recorded someone speaking also the multiple language that they speak, like I feel like I speak my languages differently. My face feels different when I speak French or English or Spanish or whatever.
I feel like my voice is not the same in French and in English as well. It's very strange.
C'est drôle, hein?
Mais je veux dire, quand je l'écoute, ça sonne relativement pareil, mais on dirait que pour moi, on dirait que j'entends autre chose. When I hear it recorded, I don't know. They sound different.
Yeah, I have the same sense, and one thing that I talk about a little bit in my writing is like the idea of a mother tongue, like how that has such a strong emotional connotation to it itself, that term and idea. And like one researcher I quote who studied this idea, like she talks about how, like for her it's a bit of a false concept, and especially because her research focuses on people like my father, he grew up in Kenya. He, simultaneously learned Swahili, Punjabi, Urdu, and English. So it's harder to say mother tongue for many, many people in the world. Although he does, Punjabi is his sort of, is the language that he feels closest to. Anyway, for me, it is that emotional connection actually bears out. It is a mother tongue. It is what my mother spoke, what I heard in the womb. Like, I do feel that there are certain embodiments that occur because you hear a language at the very start. Yeah.
Just an additional comment. My parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and they spoke Yiddish between the two of them. And I understood it, and I still understand a lot of it. I don't speak it. But there's something that when somebody, it's rare now, Hebrew is the language in Israel, and there's only very religious Jews that still speak Yiddish. But when I hear it, rarely, it's like I feel it in my gut. It's not my mother tongue. My mother tongue is English, and French is my second language, but it feels completely different. There's no other language that I have that kind of emotional reaction to, and that was kind of the basis of my question.
C'est un peu aussi comme partir en voyage et revenir, et là, entendre soudainement ta langue chez toi, quand tu reviens de voyage, ou ta langue dans un autre pays où les gens la parlent pas. J'ai passé quand même une assez longue période en 2018 en Allemagne pour travailler sur un spectacle. Je parle pas allemand, je veux dire, je baragouine, puis je peux commander dans un restaurant, puis c'est à peu près tout. Mais revenir de ce voyage-là, j'étais revenue via Montréal, puis me faire parler en français à l'aéroport, c'était comme « Ouh, bonjour! » Quand plusieurs personnes, même en Allemagne, parlaient français de toute façon, là, mais c'est pas grave. Mais on dirait qu'il y avait ce sentiment-là de revenir à la maison. Puis j'ai l'impression qu'on m'ait parlé en français ou en anglais en arrivant. Si j'étais arrivée, disons, chez moi directement, là, disons, par l'aéroport d'Ottawa, on m'aurait peut-être plus parlé en anglais, mais j'ai l'impression que j'aurais peut-être eu la même sensation de comme, soudainement, la langue qui est tout autour de moi, c'est plus quelque chose qui est très étranger, ou c'est plus quelque chose qui me demande un énorme effort d'attention pour pas être trop perdu, puis pour pas en manquer des grands bouts si je suis un peu dans la lune. Donc, il y a ça aussi.
Landscape functions in the same way too. Sometimes landscape, when you come back to your piece of rock or whatever, you're like, when you exhale into that space, for sure. There's the same, I think, language and memory. I think it has to do something with memory, probably.
And after I was in Germany for like most of November and December, and I was in Hamburg, and it's very gray and very rainy. And when I got back, it was just before Christmas here, and there was snow, and I was like, yes.
I'm home.
But it's so
you
bright.
say this is all of us are just itching to get outside into the sun, eh? Oui. Justement, je pense qu'on a le temps pour une dernière question, je crois, avant de terminer. Je ne sais pas si il y a d'autres questions du public, ou madame, je peux vous céder la parole sinon. Unless I'm scanning the room here, but easy.
I was born in Sept-Îles. My father was in the military, And so we moved every 2 years. And so I lived in all the places that nobody ever drives to on purpose. Like, like nobody gets up and says, I know, let's take a trip to Sullivan, Ontario. Nobody does that. So that's, you know, that's my growing up was right across Canada.
I'm just curious about where you get to speak, in the way that we've been talking about, where you get to speak your language, your mother tongue, where it's normal, run of the mill.
You know, I wrote a poem, and it was called My Mother's Tongue. And it goes, don't speak it, don't talk it or think it, keep it to yourself, lock it to your throat. And then it goes on and on. But it's how indigenous languages were interfered with and removed. So some people can go to Europe and be able to get their language. Indigenous people don't get that. Our language was here. And so when there's that interference or that breakage, so how do you pull it back? You know, how do you bring it back? And that's intentional to use an Inuktitut word, the ina, the unseen ones. That's intentional, and it's like a pushback. Look at mainstream. Try to figure out this word. And so, but you know, my mom had 8 years in a residential school. She was fluent in French, English, and Inuktitut. When we moved south, she stopped speaking Inuktitut. And to me, there was a practicality in it, you know, like who's going to talk with my kids that language? So but we always have to remember that as mainstream Canada, you know, Indigenous people can't go to Europe and pick up a course and learn, you know, their dialect. And for me, I'm Patla Inuit, and there's very few of us left. And so that language becomes really precious for me. And when I make use of it, it's like I feel it. It's here. It sits here with me, and it becomes, you know, important. Like that one word can carry so much importance to me. But, you know, to the reader, they'll just see something like, come quickly. But, you know, atiji, but to me, like there's an expression and there's something that's much deeper. And so we always have to remember that, like Indigenous people did not get a choice, and mother tongues were removed. And so to be able to bring it back, and especially to be able to put it into mainstream print, that becomes very important to me. It really does.
So I think that's a good note to end on. Mana, danke, merci, thank you. Merci à tous et toutes d'être venus. Je vais juste prendre un moment avant de terminer pour remercier nos 4 panélistes, pour remercier aussi Marc qui fait tellement bien le son pour tout le monde aujourd'hui. Je vais aussi vous souligner, if you have some time this afternoon you'd like to go to some other events, there's a few more this afternoon before the closing. There's the remise des prix Sciences et Littérature à Hubert Reeves et le prix PRQSC à Hélène Després. There's also Our Radical Roots with Ariella Friedman, Marilee Weisbord, and Josh Freed happening upstairs in this, I think in the Salle du Jardin at 4 o'clock. Et il y a aussi, there's the Journalism Manifesto, with Pablo Boksowski and Carrie Ratzeller upstairs also in the salle. Oh no, sorry, that's down here in the Salle Saint-Laurent and also at 4. Et si vous y êtes vers 5h30, il y aura un petit cocktail, je crois, en haut dans la salle Godin, donc pour la fermeture du festival. Merci encore une fois à tous et à toutes d'être venus. Thank you so much, the 4 of you. C'était une super belle conversation. Merci d'avoir pris le temps aujourd'hui. Bon après-midi.